Colorado Territory, 1872. The harsh winter wind howled across the open prairie like a hungry wolf, searching for warmth to steal. Zachary Benson pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his lean frame, squinting against the setting sun as his horse trudged through knee-deep snow. At 25, Zach had already seen more of life's cruelties than most men twice his age. The war between the states had taken his father, the frontier had claimed his mother, and the unforgiving Colorado winters had nearly taken him more times than he cared to count. "Just you and me again, Copper," he murmured to his chestnut gelding, whose breath formed clouds in the frigid air. "Always just us." Zach had built his life around a simple truth: the frontier was no place for attachments. Love was a luxury that men like him couldn't afford, not when survival demanded everything you had. The past 7 years had taught him that lesson well. Every time he'd allowed himself to care, the merciless West had taken it away. Better to ride alone, work alone, live alone, safer that way. The distant lights of Silver Creek flickered into view as dusk settled over the snow-covered landscape. Zach hadn't planned to stop in town, preferring the solitude of his small homestead another day's ride north. But the storm brewing on the horizon made that choice for him. Copper needed shelter as much as he did. Silver Creek had grown since Zach had last passed through. The discovery of silver in the nearby mountains had transformed what was once a sleepy trading post into a bustling frontier town. New buildings lined the muddy main street, and the sounds of a piano drifted from the Golden Nugget Saloon. Zach guided Copper toward the livery stable at the edge of town, his eyes scanning the street with the wariness that had kept him alive all these years. The stable was warm, filled with the comforting smells of hay and horses. As Zach dismounted, his boots hitting the packed earth floor with a soft thud, a voice called out from the shadows. "Be right with you, mister." The voice belonged to an old man, his beard gray as the winter sky, who emerged from a back stall wiping his hands on a rag. "Looking for a place for your horse to spend the night?" Zach nodded, already removing Copper's saddle. "An information, storm's coming. Need to know if there's a room to be had in this town." The old man, who introduced himself as Elmer, chuckled. "Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house might have a bed, though I'd hurry if I were you. Train came through earlier and rooms are scarce as hen's teeth." After settling Copper with a generous portion of oats, Zach shouldered his saddle bags and stepped back into the cold. The wind had picked up, carrying the first flakes of what promised to be a blizzard. He moved quickly down the boardwalk, his spurs jingling with each step, his tall frame and broad shoulders cutting a striking figure even bundled in his winter gear. Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house stood at the quieter end of the main street, a 2-story clapboard building with lace curtains visible through frost-trimmed windows. Warm light spilled from inside, along with the enticing aroma of fresh-baked bread. Zach hesitated at the bottom of the steps, feeling suddenly out of place. It had been months since he'd slept under a proper roof, longer still since he'd engaged in more than passing conversation with another soul. The door swung open before he could knock, and there she stood, a young woman with the most remarkable eyes he had ever seen. Deep blue like summer twilight, they seemed to look straight through the layers of frost he'd built around himself. "Are you planning to stand there all night?" she asked, her voice holding both humor and concern. "Because I think the storm might have something to say about that." Zach found himself momentarily speechless, an unusual condition for a man who preferred few words by choice. She was beautiful in a way that belonged in painted portraits, not on the edge of wilderness. Her honey-blonde hair was gathered in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, with wisps escaping to frame a face that seemed too delicate for frontier life. She wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, covered by a practical white apron. I was told Mrs. Whittaker might have a room," he finally managed. "You were told correctly. I'm Penelope O'Brien. I help Mrs. Whittaker with the boarding house." She opened the door wider. "Come in before you freeze solid." Zach stepped inside, removing his hat as he entered the warm foyer. The smell of home cooking and the crackle of a fire in the hearth stirred memories he'd long suppressed, of family dinners and his mother's gentle voice. "Mrs. Whittaker is in the kitchen," Penelope said, gesturing down a hallway. but I can show you to a room if you'd like. We have one left, small but warm." "That would be fine, Miss O'Brien." "Please call me Penny." "Everyone does," she smiled, and something in Zach's chest tightened unexpectedly. "And you are?" "Zachary Benson, Zach." "Well, Mr. Benson, follow me." She led him up a narrow staircase, her skirt swishing against the wooden steps. "What brings you to Silver Creek, mining?" He shook his head. "Just passing through. I have a small place north of here, raising cattle." "All alone?" she asked, glancing back at him with those penetrating eyes. "Yes." They reached the second floor, and Penny led him down a short hallway to a door at the end. "Here we are. It's small but clean. Mrs. Whittaker serves breakfast at 7 and dinner at 6. The washroom is at the end of the hall." Zach nodded, reaching for his wallet. "How much do I owe you?" $2 a night includes meals." She studied him for a moment. "How long will you be staying?" "Just until the storm passes." "Well, Mr. Benson, I hope you find some comfort here, however brief your stay." She handed him a key. "Dinner's almost ready if you're hungry." After she left, Zach sat heavily on the bed, wondering why his heart was racing. It was just the climb up the stairs, he told himself. Not the way her blue eyes seemed to see right through him, or how her smile had momentarily made him forget the cold he carried inside. He wouldn't be staying long enough for any of that to matter. The storm raged for 3 days, trapping everyone in Silver Creek. The snow piled in drifts taller than a man, and the wind howled with such ferocity that it rattled the windows in their frames. Zach found himself spending more time in the boarding house's cozy parlor than he had intended, drawn by the warmth of the fire, and increasingly by Penny's presence. She moved through the house with graceful efficiency, helping the elderly misses Whittaker with cooking and cleaning, always with a kind word for each boarder. Zach learned she was 22 and had come west with her father, a doctor who had died of pneumonia the previous winter. Now she worked at the boarding house and assisted the town's new doctor when needed. "I considered going back east," she told Zach on the second evening as they sat by the fire after the other boarders had retired. "My aunt in Boston wrote offering me a home, but I couldn't leave." "Why not?" Zach asked, genuinely curious. The East offered comforts and safety that the frontier couldn't match, especially for a young woman alone. Penny looked into the flames, her profile illuminated by the golden light. "Because despite everything, the hardships, the dangers, there's something honest about life here, something real." She turned those blue eyes on him. "Don't you feel it? The way the land strips away pretense, until all that's left is who you truly are." Zach stared at her, startled by how precisely she had articulated what he had never been able to put into words. The frontier had indeed stripped him down to his essentials, but he had always believed it had left him with nothing but scar tissue and survival instincts. Never had he considered that there might be value in that rawness. "I think the land just takes," he said finally, "until there's nothing left to give." Penny shook her head. "Then why stay? Why not go back to civilization?" The question lingered between them unanswered, because Zach didn't have an answer that made sense, even to himself. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally broke, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. The sun sparkled off the snow with blinding intensity as Zach made his way to the livery to check on Copper. The town was beginning to dig itself out, men shoveling paths along the main street, women hanging laundry that would freeze solid before it dried. Elmer greeted him with a toothless smile. "Your horse is fine, Mr. Benson. Been keeping him exercised in the covered corral out back." "Appreciate it," Zach replied, running a hand along Copper's neck. "I'll be heading out tomorrow at first light." "Might want to wait another day," Elmer suggested. "The passes will still be treacherous. No shame in being careful." Zach nodded noncommittally. The truth was, he was becoming uncomfortable with how comfortable he felt at Mrs. Whittaker's, or more specifically, in Penny's company. Last night he had caught himself laughing at something she said, a genuine laugh that came from deep inside, somewhere he thought had been buried years ago. Dangerous territory. As he turned to leave, gunshots rang out from the direction of the main street, 3 shots in rapid succession, followed by shouting. Zach's hand instinctively moved to the revolver on his hip as he hurried outside. A crowd had gathered in front of the bank. From the fragments of excited conversation, Zach pieced together what had happened. 3 men had attempted to rob the bank, only to be interrupted by the town marshal. In the ensuing gunfight, 1 robber had been killed, another wounded and captured, but the 3rd had escaped, taking a hostage with him. Zach's blood ran cold when he heard the description of the hostage, a young woman with blonde hair wearing a blue dress. Penny. Without conscious thought, Zach was moving, pushing through the crowd until he reached Marshal Davis, a grizzled man with a bloody gash on his forehead. "Which way did they go?" Zach demanded. The marshal looked at him through narrowed eyes. "Who's asking?" "Zachary Benson. I'm staying at Mrs. Whittaker's where Miss O'Brien works." "I can track them. I've got deputies." "Your deputies don't know these mountains in winter like I do," Zach interrupted. "And they don't have a horse ready to ride right now." He gestured to the livery where he could see Elmer already saddling Copper, the old man having overheard enough to understand what was needed. The marshal studied him for a long moment, then nodded. They headed east toward the old mining road, outlaws riding a black horse wearing a brown coat, armed with a revolver and rifle. He paused. Miss O'Brien was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Came to deposit Mrs. Whittaker's earnings when the robbery started. Zach was already moving back toward the livery. "I'll find her." "Benson," the marshal called after him. "Bring her back alive. The outlaw too, if possible, but the girl comes first." Within minutes, Zach was riding hard out of town, following tracks that were clear in the fresh snow. His mind was focused on the task with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. All the reasons he avoided attachments, all his carefully constructed walls, none of that mattered now. All that mattered was finding Penny before it was too late. The tracks led east as expected, but then veered north toward the foothills where abandoned mining camps offered shelter. Zach pushed Copper as fast as he dared on the snow-covered ground, aware that a misstep could end their pursuit before it began. The cold air burned his lungs as he rode, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. 2 hours into the pursuit, he spotted them, 2 figures on a single horse, moving slowly through a stand of pine trees. Zach reined Copper in, dismounting to continue on foot. He moved silently through the snow, keeping to the tree line for cover. Years of hunting had taught him patience and stealth. Drawing closer, he could see that Penny was seated in front of the outlaw, who had one arm around her waist, the other holding the reins. The man was young, hardly more than a boy, with a patchy beard and wild eyes that kept darting around nervously. Zach crept to within 50 yards before the outlaw sensed his presence. The young man's head snapped up, and in one fluid motion, he dismounted, dragging Penny with him and using her as a shield as he drew his revolver. "Show yourself," the outlaw shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Zach stepped out from behind a tree, his hands held away from his sides to show he wasn't reaching for his weapon. "Let the woman go," he called. "She's not part of this." "Stay back," the outlaw pressed his gun against Penny's temple. Despite her obvious fear, her eyes locked onto Zach's with a trust that pierced him to his core. "I'll kill her, I swear I will." "No, you won't," Zach said calmly, taking another step forward. "Because then you'd have nothing between you and me, and trust me, son, you don't want that." The outlaw's hand trembled. "Who are you?" "Just a man who wants to see the lady safely home." "They'll hang me," the outlaw said, desperation in his voice. "My partner's dead and Tom's captured. They'll hang me for sure." "Maybe," Zach acknowledged. "But killing her guarantees it. Let her go, and I'll make sure you get a fair trial." The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity, the only sound the harsh breathing of the outlaw and the soft whimpering of the horse tied nearby. Penny remained silent, her gaze never leaving Zach's face. Finally, the outlaw's resolve cracked. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," he said, his voice breaking. "The bank was supposed to be easy money." "Let her go," Zach repeated. "It's the only way this ends well for you." With a defeated sob, the young man lowered his gun and released Penny. She stumbled forward, and Zach moved quickly to catch her, pulling her behind him as he drew his revolver in one smooth motion. "On your knees," he ordered the outlaw, who complied without resistance. "Hands behind your head." Once the outlaw was secured, Zach turned to Penny. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, he didn't hurt me." Then, without warning, she threw herself against Zach's chest, her body trembling with delayed shock and relief. Instinctively, Zach wrapped his free arm around her, holding her close as she cried. The feeling of her against him, alive and whole, unleashed something primal and protective that he had long denied existed within him. "It's all right," he murmured into her hair. "You're safe now. I've got you." In that moment, with Penny in his arms and the vast wilderness surrounding them, Zach faced a truth he had been running from for years. The frontier didn't just take. Sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, it gave back. The return journey to Silver Creek took longer, with 3 people and 2 horses navigating the snow-covered trails. The outlaw, who they learned was named Billy Ferris, barely 19 years old, rode double with Zach, his hands bound in front of him. Penny rode copper, wrapped in Zach's heavy coat despite his protests that he didn't need it. They reached town just as darkness was falling. A crowd gathered as they rode down the main street, news of their approach having preceded them. Marshal Davis and his deputies took custody of Billy and Mrs. Whitaker rushed forward to embrace Penny, fussing over her like a mother hen. "You need rest, child," the older woman insisted, leading Penny toward the boarding house. "And hot food and tea." Penny looked back at Zach, who still sat atop the outlaw's horse. "You'll come too." He hesitated, suddenly aware of the dozens of eyes on him, of the unexpected role he had played in a drama he had never wanted to be part of. "Please," Penny added softly. He nodded, unable to deny her anything in that moment. Later, after Penny had been fussed over and fed, after the marshal had taken Zach's statement and Billy Ferris had been locked securely in the town jail, Zach found himself once again in the parlor of Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house. This time, however, the room was empty except for Penny, who sat on the sofa with a blanket around her shoulders, staring into the fire. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting with a smile that made his heart stutter. "I was afraid you might have left without saying goodbye." "I wouldn't do that," he said, taking a seat in the chair across from her. "Not after everything that happened." "Thank you," she said simply, "for coming after me." Zach shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. "No," she contradicted gently, "not anyone. Marshal Davis told me how you insisted on going alone, how you knew exactly where to look." She leaned forward. "You saved my life today, Zachary Benson." "I just did what needed doing," he mumbled, looking down at his hands. A silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Finally, Penny spoke again. "You're still planning to leave tomorrow?" He nodded. "The weather's clear. I need to get back to my place, check on things." Of course, was there disappointment in her voice, or was he imagining it? Will you come back to Silver Creek sometime?" Zach looked up, meeting her gaze. The question hung between them, laden with meaning neither of them was ready to voice aloud. "I don't usually have reason to come to town," he said carefully. Penny's eyes dimmed slightly, but she nodded. "I understand." Another silence, heavier this time. "Unless," Zach found himself saying, "I had a reason to come back." Hope flickered across her face. "And what might that reason be?" He took a deep breath. Maybe to call on a certain young lady, if she was amenable to receiving such calls. Penny's smile returned, brighter than before. "I believe she would be very amenable indeed." And so began a courtship unlike any Silver Creek had seen before. Every 2 weeks, regardless of weather, Zachary Benson would ride into town, his horse groomed, his clothes as neat as he could manage, to spend a day with Penelope O'Brien. They would walk along the creek when weather permitted, take meals at the hotel restaurant, and sometimes simply sit in Mrs. Whitaker's parlor, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Penny told him of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of her father's decision to move west after her mother died. of her dreams to someday have a home of her own filled with children and laughter. Zach, usually so reticent, found himself sharing stories of his own, of his family's farm in Missouri, of the war that had claimed his father, of his journey west in search of something he couldn't name. "I think you were looking for peace," Penny said one evening in early spring as they sat on the boarding house porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "Have you found it?" Zach considered the question, turning it over in his mind like a stone in a riverbed. "Not the way I expected to," he admitted finally. "I always thought peace would come from being alone, from not having to worry about anyone but myself." "And now," she prompted when he fell silent. He looked at her, this woman who had somehow slipped past all his defenses without even trying. "Now I'm not so sure." Spring yielded to summer and Zach's visits to town became more frequent. He found reasons to come, supplies he suddenly needed, repairs that required parts from the general store, livestock he wanted to sell or buy. The real reason was always the same, a few precious hours in Penny's company. On a warm July evening, as they walked along the banks of the creek that gave the town its name, Penny asked the question that had been growing between them. "What are we doing, Zach?" He stopped walking, turning to face her. The setting sun caught in her honey-blonde hair, creating a halo effect that made her look ethereal. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "This," she gestured between them. "These visits, these conversations, these," she blushed slightly, "these feelings, where is it all leading?" Zach swallowed hard. 6 months ago he would have run from this conversation, would have saddled Copper and ridden until Silver Creek was just a memory. But now, looking into Penny's blue eyes, he found courage he didn't know he possessed. "I hope it's leading to a future," he said softly. "A future I never thought I wanted until I met you." Penny's breath caught. "What kind of future?" "One where I don't face the frontier alone anymore." He took her hand, marveling at how small it felt in his. "One where maybe someday, if you were willing, we could build something together." "Are you asking me to marry you, Zachary Benson?" A smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Not yet," he answered honestly. "I don't have the right to ask that of you. My place is small, barely more than a cabin. The work is hard, the winters are brutal. It's no life for someone like you." Penny stepped closer, her free hand coming up to rest against his cheek. "Shouldn't I be the judge of what life is right for me? You deserve better than what I can offer right now." "What if what you offer is exactly what I want?" Her eyes held his, unflinching. "What if all those things you think should scare me away? The small cabin, the hard work, the brutal winters. What if I see those as challenges we could face together?" Zach covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press a kiss against her palm. "Then I'd say you're either the bravest or the most foolish woman I've ever met." "Perhaps a bit of both," she laughed. "But I know my own mind, Zach, in my own heart." They stood there as twilight deepened around them, on the cusp of a decision that would change both their lives forever. In the end, it was Penny who took the leap first. "Ask me," she whispered, "ask me properly." Zach took both her hands in his. "Penelope O'Brien, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of facing the frontier with me, for better or worse, through whatever comes our way?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Zachary Benson." Their wedding took place in September, when the aspen trees had turned to gold and the first hint of autumn crispness filled the air. The entire town of Silver Creek turned out to see the ceremony, held in the small church on the hill. Penny wore a dress of pale blue that matched her eyes, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Zach, uncomfortable in a new suit purchased for the occasion, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle toward him. The reception afterward was held in the town square, with tables laden with food contributed by every household. There was music and dancing, laughter and a few tears. Mrs. Whittaker cried the hardest, lamenting the loss of her helper even as she blessed the union. "You take care of her," she told Zach sternly. "She's special, that girl." "I know," he replied simply. "I will." As the celebration continued into the evening, Penny found Zach standing at the edge of the gathering, watching the townspeople with a bemused expression. "Overwhelmed?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. "A bit," he admitted. "I'm not used to so many people." "You'd better get used to it," she teased. "I expect we'll be coming to town regularly. I won't have my children growing up without knowing civilization." "Children, is it?" He raised an eyebrow. "We've only been married a few hours, Mrs. Benson." She blushed beautifully at the new name. "I like to plan ahead." He pulled her close, no longer caring who might be watching. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "I never thought I'd say those words to anyone, but I love you more than I knew was possible." "And I love you," she replied. "More than enough to face whatever the frontier throws at us." The journey to Zach's homestead took 2 days, with Penny riding beside him on a gentle mare that had been Mrs. Whittaker's wedding gift. Behind them, a packhorse carried Penny's belongings and supplies for the winter ahead. When they finally crested the last rise and Zach's cabin came into view, he felt a moment of doubt. Would she be disappointed? The place was small, just 2 rooms with a lean-to attached for storage. The barn was sturdy but plain, the corral made of rough-hewn logs. His herd of cattle, 30 head in all, grazed in the valley below. Beside him, Penny drew in a breath. "It's beautiful," she said, and to his surprise, she meant it. Her eyes took in the cabin nestled against the backdrop of pine-covered mountains, the creek running clear and cold nearby, the open meadow where wildflowers still bloomed despite the season. "It's not much," he began. "It's perfect," she interrupted. "It's a beginning." And so began their life together. The first winter was as harsh as Zach had warned, with blizzards that howled around their cabin for days on end. But inside, warmed by the fire and by each other, they created a haven against the wilderness. Penny transformed the simple cabin with curtains she sewed from flour sacks, with shelves Zach built to hold the books she had brought, with the 100 small touches that turned a shelter into a home. When spring came, they expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and enlarging the main room. Zach taught Penny to ride properly, to shoot, to identify the signs of changing weather. She taught him the comfort of sharing burdens, the joy of planning for a future together, the peace that came with knowing you were no longer alone. Their first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Penny's mother, arrived the following winter, a night of fear and wonder as Penny labored through a snowstorm with only Zach to help her. When he finally held his daughter in his arms, tiny and perfect with a dusting of blonde hair, something shifted permanently inside him. This was what the frontier had been preparing him for all along, not just survival, but the creation of something that would outlast him. As the years passed, their family grew. A son joined them 2 years later, then another daughter. The herd expanded, requiring more hands to manage, and Zach hired 2 young cowboys who built their own cabin nearby. The original homestead grew into a proper ranch, with outbuildings, a vegetable garden tended by Penny, and eventually, a schoolhouse where she taught not only their children but those of neighboring ranchers. One evening, 10 years after they had first met, Zach found Penny standing on the porch of their now substantial home, watching the sunset. Their children played in the yard, their laughter rising like music on the evening air. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She leaned back against him. "About the first time I saw you, standing in the snow outside Mrs. Whittaker's, looking like you were afraid to come in from the cold." "I was," he admitted. "Not of the house, but of what might happen if I let myself get comfortable." And now she turned in his arms to face him. Zach looked past her to their home, their land, their children, all the things he once believed he could never have, never deserve. "Now I know that the frontier doesn't just take, it gives too. It gave me you." Penny reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that years of sun and wind had etched around his eyes. "We built this together, Zachary Benson. From nothing but hope and hard work. And love," he added. "Don't forget that part." "Never," she promised, rising on tiptoe to kiss him as the last rays of sunlight painted the world in gold around them. "That's the part I'll remember until my dying day. How love can bloom even in the harshest wilderness, if only you're brave enough to let it. As darkness settled over the land they had tamed together, Zach held his wife close, marveling at the journey that had brought him from the lonely, hardened man he once was to this moment of profound belonging. The frontier had not defeated him after all. With Penny by his side, he had not just survived it, he had made it home.